Before we start, if you love the kind of history that feels too dramatic to be real, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe. Because this is the story of how one royal insult set an entire continent on fire for over a century. Imagine being so offended, you start a war that outlives your grandchildren. That's not a figure of speech, it's exactly what happened in 14th century Europe. The year was 1337. The air across the channel smelled of rain and rivalry. Two kings, Edward III of England and Philip VI of France, stood on opposite shores, glaring across the water as though the sea itself were an insult. England and France weren't just neighbors. They were distant cousins with a shared history written in blood. The English crown belonged to the Plantagenets, descendants of Norman conquerors who had once ruled half of France. The French throne sat with the Capetians, the line that had outlasted centuries of rebellion to claim divine right over all who spoke its language. But beneath the crowns and titles lay something messier: feudal law. The medieval world was built on a web of oaths, lords owing vassalage to other lords, who in turn owed loyalty to kings. And sometimes, one king owed loyalty to another. Edward III hated that web. He was a young king, ambitious and restless, ruling a wealthy island that felt smaller every year. His ancestors had built England from French stone, yet his own kingdom was hemmed in by debts and duties that stretched across the channel. One of those duties was his biggest humiliation. As Duke of Aquitaine, he technically owed allegiance to the King of France. To Philip VI, that was only proper. To Edward, it was an insult no crown should bear. The tension simmered quietly until bloodlines turned it into fire. When France's last Capetian king, Charles IV, died without a son, Europe held its breath. By blood, Edward, through his mother Isabella, a French princess, was the next legitimate heir. But the French nobles invoked an old clause of Salic law, declaring that the throne could not pass through a woman's line. That law had been forgotten for generations. But now, it served its purpose perfectly, to keep an Englishman from sitting on France's throne. Philip VI, a cousin, was crowned instead. To Edward, this was theft wrapped in ceremony. To Philip, it was survival. Their letters were polite, their intentions poisonous. Diplomacy quickly turned into defiance. The kings of England and France were now both claiming to be the rightful ruler of the same kingdom. It wasn't just pride, it was profit. Trade bound their economies like rope around a throat. England's wool fed the looms of Flanders, a region under French influence. Flanders depended on English exports, yet its rulers owed taxes to France. When Philip attempted to choke England's wool trade, Edward retaliated by courting Flemish merchants, promising them independence in exchange for loyalty. Money became a weapon sharper than any sword. Then came Gascony, the jewel of Aquitaine, a coastal duchy of vineyards and ports. Gascony was England's gateway to continental riches and a constant reminder of divided loyalties. When Philip seized it outright in 1337, he crossed a line that centuries of diplomacy had drawn but never dared test. Edward's patience snapped. He gathered his lords at Westminster, laid claim not only to Gascony, but to the crown of France itself, and declared war. The 100 Years' War had begun not from vengeance, but from vanity. The nobles cheered, the clergy blessed it, and the peasants simply paid for it. For them, it wasn't a matter of pride, but survival. They were the ones who would till the burned fields and bury the unburied dead, yet even they felt a flicker of excitement. War meant wages, and the promise, however hollow, of glory. Across the Channel, Philip VI prepared for the invasion he had accidentally invited. His armies were vast but untested, filled with nobles eager for honor, not strategy. He believed the war would end quickly, that one decisive battle would crush the upstart king. He was wrong. Edward III didn't play by medieval rules. He abandoned the slow etiquette of noble warfare, no declarations of battle at dawn, no chivalric parades. He struck where no one expected, raiding coastal towns, torching supply depots, attacking from the sea like a pirate with a crown. The French called it dishonorable. History would call it modern. Within months, English fleets ruled the Channel. Norman villages burned. The French economy, already strained, began to suffocate under the cost of defense. The war that had started as a dispute over succession had become a contest of endurance and of invention. But Edward was only beginning. He wanted France, not just its taxes. To claim it, he would have to march deeper into its heart through forests, over rivers, across 1,000 years of royal pride. And somewhere ahead of him waited a battlefield that would end one age and begin another. The banners had been raised, and the dice were thrown. Now, Europe held its breath. Edward III's war machine moved like a storm, swift, unpredictable, and mercilessly efficient. What had begun as a quarrel between two kings had become a transformation of warfare itself. The English king didn't just want revenge. He wanted control of history. The first English fleets prowled the Channel, raiding ports from Brittany to Normandy. They struck by surprise, burned everything of value, and vanished into the mist before French armies could respond. It was no longer a duel between gentlemen. It was economy turned to ash, a message written in smoke. England had learned how to fight dirty and win. By 1346, Edward was ready for something bigger. His army, small, disciplined, and frighteningly modern, landed on the coast of Normandy. The campaign that followed would reshape how Europe fought wars forever. They moved quickly, burning cane, pillaging the countryside, cutting through resistance with terrifying precision. Word of their advance spread faster than their arrows. King Philip VI, humiliated and enraged, gathered his forces to crush them once and for all. What he commanded was not just an army. It was the pride of medieval Europe. Tens of thousands of armored knights, banners gleaming, their armor polished brighter than the Sunday. They rode for honor, for vengeance, and for the certainty that courage was still enough to decide the fate of kings. The two forces met near a quiet village called Crécy. It was the kind of place no mapmaker would have bothered to name until that summer day turned it into legend. Edward's men took the high ground and built their defense. Stakes were driven into the earth, trenches dug, and behind them stood rows of archers, peasants, armed with longbows taller than themselves. They wore no armor, no family crests, no songs of glory. But what they carried would destroy the world as their fathers knew it. The French arrived at dusk. Dust clouded the horizon, a shimmering wall of steel and horses. Trumpets blared, prayers were whispered, and then the charge began. For centuries, the mounted knight had been invincible. The sheer weight of armored cavalry could crush any line of footmen. But Crécy would prove that even the mightiest traditions can die in an afternoon. When the French charged uphill, the air came alive. Thousands of arrows whistled through the sky, an unending storm that turned daylight gray. Arrows struck like rain, pierced plate, shattered visors, punched through chainmail. Horses screamed and collapsed. Knights stumbled and fell into the mud. Those who followed trampled their fallen comrades, blinded by the chaos. And still, the arrows fell. Wave after wave of French cavalry hurled themselves into the storm, and wave after wave broke upon it. The longbow was not noble, it was efficient. It was war-stripped of ceremony, reduced to science and muscle memory. By nightfall, the field at Crécy was silent, but for the groans of the dying. Among them lay hundreds of France's finest, the men who had defined the age of chivalry. The flower of French knighthood had withered in a single day. Edward's smaller army had done the impossible. His tactics, precision, and patience had rewritten the rules of war. From that moment, the sword began to bow to the bowstring. The message was clear. The world had changed. France, though wounded, refused to surrender. Pride, after all, is harder to kill than a king. Philip retreated, promising revenge, but Edward pressed forward, determined to carve his victory into the map itself. His next target was Calais, the port that guarded the shortest crossing between England and France. Whoever held it could control the channel and starve the other. The siege began in September 1346. It lasted 11 months. Inside the city, famine devoured everything. Horses, dogs, even rats disappeared from the streets. Mothers sold their hair for food. The people of Calais clung to their walls while outside. The English settled in as if for a long winter. They built wooden houses, dug wells, baked bread. Edward was not fighting a battle, he was establishing a colony. When Calais finally surrendered in August 1347, it wasn't through defeat, but starvation. Edward demanded that 6 of the city's leaders come before him barefoot, with ropes around their necks. carrying the keys to the gates. They obeyed, gaunt and trembling, ready to die. Chroniclers say his queen, Philippa of Hainaut, fell to her knees and begged for mercy, and that Edward, moved by her plea, spared their lives. Whether truth or theater, the gesture cemented his image as both conqueror and king. Calais became England's bridgehead on the continent, a symbol of power carved out of French soil. The city would remain English for the next 200 years, but triumph has a habit of turning sour. The cost of war was enormous. England's treasury was drained, its people taxed into exhaustion. In France, villages burned, fields lay fallow, trade collapsed. The peasants starved while their kings measured glory in acres and corpses. And then, as if the heavens themselves had grown disgusted, something darker arrived, something that didn't care which banner flew above a castle wall. The ships that carried soldiers and supplies across the channel also carried rats, and on those rats rode the fleas that carried death. In 1348, a new enemy swept across Europe, the Black Death. It cared nothing for crowns or courage. It moved through armies and cities alike, silent and unstoppable. Soldiers fell beside civilians, nobles beside beggars. The war that had seemed eternal suddenly paused, as if even pride had to bow to plague. The 100 Years' War was only in its beginning, but for a brief, breathless moment, both England and France would forget about banners, borders, and thrones. They would remember what it meant to fear something greater than themselves. And when the plague finally passed, the world that rose from its ashes would not be the same. The fire had been lit. The storm was gathering, and Europe was about to face its first reckoning. By the summer of 1346, France had become a chessboard, and Edward III was done playing by anyone else's rules. The war that began over a crown had turned into a machine. It moved with rhythm ships, carts, and iron hooves crossing from England to Normandy, each wheel turning for one man's claim. What started as parchment and pride now rolled forward like thunder. The English invasion was not grand. It was cold, methodical. Edward landed at Saint-Vaast with an army of around 15,000 archers, men-at-arms, engineers, and pages. No gilded armor, no noble declarations, just discipline. Behind them, hundreds of ships brought barrels of arrows, horses, salt beef, and fear. They marched south through Normandy, cutting across villages and vineyards, stripping the land of everything it could offer. Smoke rose behind them like gray banners. The English king did not fight for land. He fought for terror. He wanted France to see its own helplessness reflected in the burning horizon. The French king, Philip VI, answered with fury. He summoned his vassals, called for banners from Flanders to Burgundy, gathering tens of thousands of knights and men-at-arms. The flower of France was coming to crush the invaders. Yet in their haste to defend honor, they forgot how the world was changing. For centuries, the battlefield had been a stage where courage equaled victory. But courage does not bend the wind. It cannot measure distance. It cannot outpace an arrow. Edward had learned something the French had not, that war was no longer a matter of valor, but of geometry. His weapon of choice was 6 feet of carved yew, the English longbow. Simple, deadly, and democratic. Each archer carried a small arsenal, hundreds of arrows, each tipped with hardened iron. Drawn with a strength of over 100 pounds, these arrows could pierce armor, shatter shields, and still fly another 100 yards. A knight's armor, once a fortress, had become a coffin waiting to be sealed. When Edward's scouts reported that the French army was approaching fast from the south, the king chose his ground carefully, a sloping field outside a small village called Crécy-en-Ponthieu. Gentle hills, dry soil, and open space. Perfect for defense, perfect for death. On August 26th, under a sun that baked the dust into powder, both armies saw each other for the first time. The French outnumbered the English nearly 2 to 1. Their ranks gleamed like rivers of steel. Trumpets cried out from the hillsides. The air buzzed with tension and flies. Edward divided his army into 3 lines. The front was led by his son, Edward of Woodstock, the 17-year-old who would soon be known as the Black Prince. Archers lined the flanks, their longbows strung and waxed, their arrows stuck in the ground before them for speed. Behind them stood dismounted knights, ready to protect the line if it broke. Then they waited. The first to attack were the Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries in French service. They were professionals, but their bows were heavy, slow, and useless once wet. The skies darkened suddenly. A storm had passed earlier, drenching their strings. When they advanced and loosed their bolts, their shots fell short. Edward gave a single command. The longbowmen answered with thunder. 10,000 arrows rose and fell in unison. The sound was not a whistle, it was a scream, a tearing of air. The Genoese faltered. Arrows pierced through shields, necks, and joints of armor. Men stumbled and fell. The French knights behind them, impatient and arrogant, rode forward, trampling their own allies. What followed was chaos dressed in heraldry. Hundreds of horses panicked, crashing into lines of infantry. The French charged again and again up the slope, into an invisible wall of arrows. Armor crumpled like tin. Lances splintered. The ground turned slick. A summer storm of death fell for hours. And above it all, the young Black Prince stood at the center of the maelstrom, his banner flickering against the smoke, his face streaked with dust and sweat. At one point, the French nearly broke through to his position. Messengers rushed to Edward, asking if he would send reinforcements. The king replied calmly, "Let the boy win his spurs." By nightfall, the French were broken, 20,000 dead or captured. Among them, the blind King John of Bohemia, who had ridden into battle tied to his knights, so he could swing blindly toward the sound of combat. When they found him later, his hands still gripped his sword. The English buried him with honor. Crécy was not just a battle. It was an ending the death of chivalry, the funeral of the mounted knight. The longbow had reshaped Europe in a single afternoon. The English camped amid the corpses that night. They lit fires, not to celebrate, but to count the living. Some sang softly. Some just stared into the darkness, where the moans of dying men carried on the wind. The smoke that rose over Crécy was not victory, it was prophecy. Edward marched north toward Calais, his next prize. The city was a fortress on the sea, its walls rising from a peninsula surrounded by tidal marshes. Whoever controlled Calais controlled the channel, the throat of Europe. The siege of Calais began in September 1346 and would last for almost a year. Edward surrounded the city by land while his navy blockaded it by sea. The French tried again and again to send food, but English ships hunted their convoys relentlessly. Inside the walls, the citizens starved. They ate horses, dogs, even rats. The smell of rot became part of the air. Outside, the English built something extraordinary, a wooden town. Rows of huts, bakeries, taverns, and even a small church rose from the mud. The army had turned occupation into architecture. It was war by patience, not passion. The chroniclers wrote that Edward walked among his men each evening, speaking little, his eyes fixed on the walls that refused to fall. He knew victory was only a matter of hunger and time. By midsummer 1347, the defenders were too weak to stand. The people begged their governor, Jean de Vienne, to surrender before the city consumed itself entirely. Edward demanded a ritual. 6 of the wealthiest citizens were to come before him, barefoot, in their shirts, with ropes around their necks, carrying the keys to the gates. Chroniclers recorded that Queen Philippa fell to her knees and begged her husband to spare them, for the sake of their children. Whether out of mercy or performance, Edward relented. The men were spared, and Calais became English. For 2 centuries it would remain that way, a scar on the French coast, a monument to humiliation. But while kings traded fortresses, the common folk bore the cost. Fields lay untended, villages emptied, and famine crept across both realms. Even those untouched by sword or arrow felt the weight of this endless feud, pressing on their backs like winter frost. And yet, something even darker was already spreading. From the east came rumors of a sickness, a fever that turned men black before the dawn. Ships whispered of it in harbors. Priests mentioned it in half-finished sermons. No one believed it could cross the sea, but death travels faster than wind. In the ports of Italy, then Provence, then Gascony, it appeared first as a cough, then as silence. Merchants carried it north. Rats carried it farther. By the time Edward celebrated his triumph at Calais, the plague was already in the holds of English ships, hidden in the grain that fed his army. Before the year ended, it would reach both kingdoms. Before the decade was done, it would kill half of Europe. The 100 Years' War had begun with pride and politics. But soon, neither kings nor crowns would matter. When the Black Death came, all banners would fall together. The banners still fluttered above Calais when the cheering began to fade. England had won again, but no one felt victorious. Behind the songs and the painted shields lay exhaustion. The army had been on campaign for nearly 2 years. The men's boots were in tatters, their bodies lean from months of salted meat and fever. Even the horses looked hollow-eyed, as if they too understood that triumph was a kind of burden. The war had changed them all. When Edward III finally returned to England, the ports erupted with joy. Bells rang from London to Canterbury. But celebration cannot fill an empty stomach. The cost of war had drained the treasury dry. Taxes rose. Merchants grumbled. Farmers muttered that the king's glory had eaten their winter grain. Across the Channel, France bled from every pore. Her fields lay blackened, her roads choked with the wreckage of flight. Peasants fled the fighting, carrying what little they owned, while lords quarreled over the ruins. The air of Europe was changing. It smelled of smoke, salt, and fear. In Paris, King Philip VI sat beneath a golden canopy that no longer impressed anyone. His nobles argued openly, each accusing the other of cowardice at Crécy. Merchants demanded protection for their trade routes. Bishops whispered that God's wrath had fallen on the kingdom. The French crown, once the envy of Europe, looked suddenly fragile, as if too much sunlight might crack it. Meanwhile, England's court turned its victories into legend. The young Black Prince was celebrated like a second Alexander. His name carried the taste of both awe and dread. But those who had stood beside him at Crécy saw him differently. They remembered the mud, the screams, the stench of death that clung to his armor. They remembered that the boy who rode into battle laughing had returned silent. In private, Edward III confessed to his chroniclers that he did not expect the war to end in his lifetime. He was right. The 100 Years' War was not a conflict, it was a generation's inheritance. And so, while kings dreamed of crowns, the world beneath them began to rot. Trade slowed. Ships moved more cautiously across the Channel, wary of privateers. The same winds that carried English wool and Gascon wine now carried something invisible, something far deadlier than steel. It came in whispers at first. A sickness in Genoa, a fever in Marseille. No one believed it could touch the north. Armies returned home and brought more than stories. They carried fatigue, hunger, and rumors of ships drifting into port with their crews already dead. But no one yet understood what it meant. In England, chroniclers wrote that the winter of 1347 was unusually still. The sky hung low for months, as though waiting. The rain came too late for the harvest. In the south of France, traders spoke of rats swarming the granaries, of sailors coughing black into their hands. Priests in Avignon held processions against pestilence, but the candles kept blowing out. And while the sickness crept closer, kings continued their feud as if the world itself were not beginning to die. Edward ordered new fortifications at Calais, turning it into a mirror of London. Markets opened under English law. French merchants traded side by side with their conquerors. Children born in Calais grew up speaking both tongues, not realizing they stood on cursed ground. For a generation, it seemed as if England had gained a second capital stone by stone, built upon silence. But the silence did not last. In 1348, the first reports reached the English coast. Ships from Gascony arriving half-crewed, their decks littered with bodies. The cargo holds were full of spoiled grain and dead rats. A few weeks later, similar stories came from Normandy. Entire villages vanished overnight. The war slowed not because peace was declared, but because death had declared it. Across France, armies disbanded themselves. Soldiers returned home to find their towns empty. Priests died faster than they could bury the faithful. Markets closed. Fields went unplowed. Chroniclers wrote of wolves wandering the outskirts of Paris. England watched from across the sea, convinced at first that the sickness was a foreign curse. But the Channel was no barrier. In the spring of 1349, the Black Death reached the south coast of England, carried by the same winds that had once carried victory. That, however, is another story. For now, in the final months of 1347, the world stood on the edge of something it could not name. The kings still plotted, the armies still trained, but every plan was shadowed by unease. The very rhythm of life seemed slower, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Even the veterans of Crécy, hardened men who had seen the worst of war, began to speak in whispers about omens. They said the sun seemed dimmer, that the birds had grown quiet, that the sea no longer smelled the same. In the monasteries of northern France, monks recorded dreams of blackened skies and bells ringing without hands. In England, a chronicler described the sound of distant thunder on clear days. Fear had no name yet, but it had already taken root. The 100 Years' War had shown humanity its capacity for destruction. What was coming next would show it something worse, its helplessness. For when war ends, there is always someone left to bury the dead. But what happens when there are no hands left to dig the graves? The world was about to find out. The war paused, not because the kings had grown weary, but because the world itself began to die. It started quietly, an unfamiliar stillness creeping into the ports of southern France. Ships that had once carried wine and silk now drifted into harbor like coffins. Their sails were torn, their decks abandoned, and the smell of death clung to the wood long after the tide pulled them in. At first, no one understood. Sailors were found slumped over their ropes, black stains blooming beneath their skin. The local physicians spoke of bad air, divine punishment, poisoned wells. Priests performed processions through the streets, incense burning so thick that the sun turned copper, but the smoke did nothing. The bells kept tolling, from Marseille to Avignon, from Genoa to Bordeaux. The sickness moved faster than any army, and by the time the French realized it could not be contained, it had already crossed the mountains, already entered the blood of Europe. The chroniclers later called it the Black Death. Those who lived through it did not call it anything at all. There were no words left for what they saw. By 1348, the rhythm of life had stopped. The familiar sounds of trade, of laughter, of markets and bells vanished. In their place came the muffled cries of the dying and the hollow clatter of carts carrying the dead to open pits. Whole villages disappeared between one sunrise and the next. The plague killed without logic or mercy. It struck noble and peasant, priest and prostitute, father and infant. Some died in hours, some lingered for days, fevered and blackened, skin bursting with sores. The survivors looked into the faces of the dead and saw their own reflection waiting. No chronicler could record fast enough. In Paris alone, thousands perished each week. The dead outnumbered the living so completely that the cemeteries overflowed. New pits were dug in the fields outside the city walls, layer upon layer of corpses stacked beneath a thin crust of soil. The war had once made Europe bleed. Now the plague made it rot. The armies dispersed. No order was given, no treaty signed. Soldiers simply stopped marching. Disease does not care for banners. It travels with them. By the time Edward III heard that his men in Calais had begun to die in their tents, it was already too late. The same ships that carried his victory home now carried the plague. England greeted its return like an old enemy. The sickness reached the southern ports, Dorset, Bristol, then London. Within months, half the capital was dead. So many priests had died that there were none left to bury the fallen. Corpses lay piled in churchyards until even the holy ground refused them. Chroniclers wrote that dogs and birds would not feed on the bodies. They too had vanished. The king ordered days of prayer and fasting. He closed the courts, halted trade, and even banned gatherings on feast days. But no decree could hold back death. It seeped through walls, through windows, through prayers. Families locked themselves indoors, and when the doors opened again, the houses were silent. Across the Channel, France was worse. The countryside, already ruined by war, now became a grave. The harvest rotted in the fields. Roads were empty except for the wheels of death carts. Monasteries fell silent. In Avignon, the papal city fires were kept burning day and night in hopes of cleansing the air, but the smoke only thickened the fear. And yet the strangest thing was not the dying, it was the living. Some wandered the streets in wild repentance, whipping their own backs until they bled, hoping that pain might buy forgiveness. Others drank and feasted among the graves, insisting that if death was inevitable, it should at least find them laughing. The lines between sin and salvation blurred until no one could tell which side they stood on. The clergy's voice faltered. The church had always offered answers. Wars were divine punishment. Famine was a test of faith. But this was something else. The priests who preached hope in the morning were dead by nightfall. The bishops who promised deliverance found their cathedrals turned into morgues. A silence fell across Christendom, a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. In the ruins of Normandy, a few soldiers who had once served under the Black Prince built small pyres for their comrades, praying that the smoke would rise to heaven. They spoke of the battles at Crécy and Calais as if they had happened in another lifetime. Now, the enemy was invisible and everywhere. Those who survived began to move. They left the cities for the countryside, carrying the sickness with them. Villages closed their gates, towns set guards to burn travelers' clothes before allowing them entry. Suspicion replaced faith. Families abandoned one another at the first sign of fever. Some locked the sick in their houses and walked away, unable to look back. The idea of Europe of shared faith, shared blood, shared destiny died in those years. All that remained was fear. And yet, through that darkness, something began to stir. Among the ruins, the peasants who had once bowed to their lords began to ask dangerous questions. Why had God allowed this? Why had the rich survived while the poor were left to burn? Why obey kings and priests who could not even bury their own? The Black Death had not just emptied graves, it had emptied belief. By the end of 1351, when the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe was unrecognizable. Entire regions had vanished from the map. In some places, the dead outnumbered the living 5-1. The war, once unstoppable, lay in ruins alongside its armies. The very idea of glory felt obscene. Edward's once great kingdom stood haunted by its own survival. The victory at Calais meant nothing now. There was no triumph in being the last man standing when the battlefield itself had turned into a grave. And yet life always finds its way back. The first signs of recovery were faint. A single bell tolling again in London, a small market reopening in Rouen, a child's laughter in a field that had once been a burial pit. But the laughter sounded different now, quieter, cautious, touched by memory. The survivors emerged, changed. They had looked upon death and found that kings could not protect them, priests could not save them, and the world they knew could disappear in a breath. Out of that realization grew something new, something the old order could never have allowed. It was not rebellion yet, but it was its seed. Because once a man has buried his whole family, it becomes very hard to fear another lord. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe did not awaken, it staggered. The silence that had blanketed the land for years began to lift, revealing not peace but absence. Fields once thick with crops were overgrown with weeds. The air smelled of soil and smoke and old graves. There were too few hands left to bury the rest. Churches stood empty, bells cracked, altars covered in dust. The sound of life returned only as whispers, plow blades cutting dry earth. The shuffle of survivors searching through ruins for something they could still call home. The dead had left behind an inheritance of chaos. In France, the royal court struggled to reassemble its world. The plague had taken bishops, advisors, tax collectors, and soldiers alike. The machinery of monarchy creaked without the gears that once turned it. The king's seal still hung heavy with wax, but no one left alive could read half the documents it stamped. Those who survived saw opportunity. Peasants who had once bowed to their masters now found the fields untended and the barns empty. The lords needed them more than ever, but they were in no hurry to return to servitude. Wages rose, rents fell, and whispers of defiance spread like wildfire through the countryside. It was in these ashes that the Jacquerie began. In the spring of 1358, the peasants of northern France finally broke. They had endured famine, war, and plague. But the final insult came when the nobles safe in their keeps demanded new taxes to rebuild their lost fortunes. The peasants had buried their families. Now they were asked to pay for the burials of their master's pride. The uprising started in small villages near Beauvais, where a group of men armed with flails and axes refused to deliver grain to their lord's castle. Within days, it had spread across the countryside. The peasants gave themselves a name, the Jacques Bonhomme, Good Fellow Jack. a mocking echo of how the nobles had always dismissed them. Their cry was not of vengeance, but of exhaustion. "We have carried the lords on our backs too long," one chronicler wrote. The rebellion was not organized. It was a storm without a captain. Peasants poured into castles, burning manors, killing those who had once commanded them. The chroniclers, most of them noblemen, wrote of atrocities of fields drenched in blood, of noble women slain beside their husbands. But behind those accounts lay another truth, that the old order was cracking. The Black Death had taught the survivors that death came for all men, no matter their titles. The Jacquerie proved they had not forgotten. The nobility responded with fury. The young Charles the Dauphin, later Charles V, led a campaign of retribution. Mounted knights swept through the villages, burning everything that moved. Entire communities were slaughtered. The rebellion, which had risen like a fever, was crushed in less than 2 months. But even in defeat, the peasants had changed the world. They had spoken the unspeakable, that a kingdom built on fear could crumble. England watched from across the sea, seeing in France's turmoil a reflection of its own. The same plague that had emptied French villages had hollowed English towns. Fields lay abandoned there too, rents collapsed, and suddenly the rigid hierarchies of old England began to sag under the weight of reality. For the first time, a plowman could demand payment instead of obedience. The lords were horrified. The old balance of power, God above, king beneath, and the poor at the bottom, no longer fit the world that had survived the plague. It was as if death had erased the script of history and left humanity to improvise. And improvise they did. Markets shifted. Towns that had once been dependent on feudal lords began to govern themselves. In some places, local guilds took control, setting prices and wages. In others, wandering preachers filled the empty pulpits, proclaiming that God had turned his face away from kings and now spoke through common men. But if God had gone silent, men were learning to listen to themselves. Across Europe, a quiet transformation began, not in palaces or cathedrals, but in workshops and farmhouses. The survivors of the plague were fewer, but stronger. They demanded fair pay, cleaner streets, and safer markets. They wanted more than survival. They wanted meaning. War had paused, but it had not ended. Edward III still claimed the French crown, and the English garrisons still held Calais. Yet the faces that looked out from the battlements were not those of proud knights anymore. They were gaunt, sunken-eyed soldiers who had seen the world end once and were not eager to watch it end again. Among them, in the years following the plague, stood a figure who would one day restore the rhythm of battle, a quiet king, in waiting across the Channel, Charles the Wise. But before his wisdom could shape a nation, France had to survive its own madness. In the towns, famine followed plague, and lawlessness grew. Bandits roamed the countryside, former soldiers with no war left to fight. The people called them routiers, men of the roads. They plundered churches, took hostages, and sold villages back to their own inhabitants. Even priests began carrying knives. France had become a kingdom of ghosts and thieves. And through it all, the memory of the plague lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Every cough was met with suspicion, every bruise with dread. The survivors wore amulets, burned herbs, painted crosses on their doors. They still feared that death might simply be waiting for its turn to return. But fear, like fire, can also forge. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny brought a brief pause, a peace born not from diplomacy, but exhaustion. France ceded territory, England gained gold, and for a moment, both kings pretended to believe the nightmare was over. Yet beneath the surface, neither kingdom was the same. The war that had begun with kings now belonged to nations. No one would say it aloud yet, but in the hearts of peasants, merchants, and soldiers alike, something new was taking shape, a faint awareness that loyalty to land and language meant more than loyalty to lords. In the stillness that followed the plague, the idea of France began to rise not as a dynasty, but as a people. And across the Channel, the same quiet awakening stirred in England. Two nations, reborn in ruin, were learning to define themselves not by bloodlines, but by endurance. For a moment, history seemed to rest. The smoke cleared, the graves sank, and the wind carried the smell of spring again. But Europe had not escaped its curse, it had only caught its breath. The 100 Years' War was far from finished. The kings who had survived would soon pass, and new ones would rise with different ambitions. In France, the embers of rebellion still glowed under the ash. In England, new heirs dreamed of crowns that shimmered across the sea. The plague had taught men that even death could not stop them, and that, perhaps, was the most dangerous lesson of all. Because after the silence comes the sound of drums again. After the silence, the drums returned. They did not sound like triumph, more like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Out of famine, plague, and humiliation, France began to stir again. Slowly, painfully, like a wounded animal testing the ground beneath its feet. The kingdom had been broken, burned, and bled dry. Yet it still breathed. In 1364, the crown passed to a man who did not wear it with pride, but with patience. Charles V, later known as Charles the Wise. He inherited not a nation, but a ghost, its fields empty, its nobles divided, its people scattered. England still held vast tracts of land from Normandy to Aquitaine. French coins bore English kings, and English merchants walked the docks of Calais as if they were Londoners. France was alive in name only. But Charles understood something his father and grandfather never had, that wars are not won by strength, but by stability. He had watched the chaos of his youth, the plague, the rebellions, the endless bloodletting, and he had learned from it. He would not charge into battle waving banners. He would rebuild quietly, like a mason setting stone after stone in the dark. His sword was strategy. His armor was patience. And to wield that sword, he needed a hand strong enough to hold it. That hand came in the form of Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was everything a knight was not supposed to be. He was short, rough-faced, broad-shouldered, born of minor Breton nobility, and dismissed by his peers as too coarse for court. But in him burned the kind of discipline the new France needed. He was not a champion of chivalry, he was its gravedigger. Charles appointed him Constable of France, commander of the royal armies. Together, they began to change the rules. Gone were the reckless charges of shining armor and trumpet calls. Du Guesclin fought in shadows, in forests, on narrow roads where cavalry could not ride. He used small bands of loyal men, disciplined, loyal, and fast. They struck at night, seized supply lines, and vanished before the English could form ranks. He taught France how to fight like a nation too poor to waste men and too proud to surrender. At first, the English laughed. They had grown used to easy victories, to French nobles who rode into battle as if to a festival. But laughter turned to confusion, then to anger. Every month, another outpost fell. Every year, the French recovered another province. The tide, imperceptible at first, began to turn. It started in Normandy, where French raiders harassed English garrisons until they abandoned their posts. Then in Brittany, where Du Guesclin used local loyalty to dismantle English influence piece by piece. In Poitou, English patrols vanished into the woods and never returned. For the first time in a generation, English captains began to fear the French countryside. Charles the Wise did not celebrate. He rebuilt. He reformed the currency, reorganized the army, restored law to cities that had forgotten it. He taxed carefully but fairly, aware that peasants who had survived plague and famine would not survive another king's arrogance. France had been ruled by passion for too long. Now, it was ruled by intellect. In the grand halls of Paris, scholars returned to their desks. The university reopened its doors. Trade resumed along the Seine. The city that had once been the heart of Europe's decay began to glow again, faintly, like an ember coaxed back to life. And yet, for all his wisdom, Charles wore his crown like a burden. He never forgot how fragile his kingdom was. He ruled from behind walls, fearful of poison, distrustful of crowds. He rarely rode to war himself. His was not the heroism of the battlefield, but the endurance of rebuilding a world that had forgotten how to believe in itself. Across the Channel, England was not what it had been either. Edward III, once the architect of empire, was growing old. His sons quarreled. His coffers emptied. The Black Prince, once the terror of France, now lay sick with a wasting illness, his strength gone. He had lived long enough to see his victories dissolve in the fog of time, The once mighty English war machine slowed under the weight of debt and memory. By 1369, France began to reclaim its land openly. Town by town, banner by banner, the lilies returned. The English, stretched thin, began to withdraw toward the coast, retreating behind the walls of Calais. The age of easy conquest was over, but victory did not come without ghosts. The plague still haunted the countryside, returning in waves every decade. The fields of France were littered not with the bones of battle, but with the empty homes of the forgotten. Many villages never rose again. Some towns simply disappeared from maps. Still, the living pressed forward. Charles V built alliances through marriage, trade, and diplomacy. He avoided open war, knowing that France could not afford another Crécy. Instead, he waged a quieter campaign, a war of exhaustion, of attrition, of waiting. He told his generals, "Do not seek battle unless it must come to you." It was a new creed for a kingdom once addicted to glory. Du Guesclin, meanwhile, became the face of France's new identity. He did not shine like the knights of old he endured. His troops adored him because he shared their rations, marched beside them in the rain, and slept in the mud without complaint. Chroniclers wrote that he was the first commander who understood that a soldier's stomach was as vital as his sword. He fought not for honor, but for home. In one campaign, Du Guesclin recaptured Brittany, outmaneuvering English allies without ever engaging in a pitched battle. In another, he reclaimed Anjou and Maine, striking so quickly that English messengers could not report the losses before they multiplied. His victories were not grand enough for song, but they were steady enough to rebuild a nation. And through it all, Charles watched from Paris, chronicling each gain on a map scarred with loss. Every province reclaimed was like a wound stitched shut. Every stronghold retaken was another breath in the lungs of a kingdom that had once stopped breathing entirely. By 1376, England was in decline. The Black Prince died that year, followed by Edward III soon after. A child, Richard II, ascended the throne, while across the Channel, France stood united for the first time in half a century. The lilies had outlasted the lions. Still, Charles V never celebrated his triumph. He ruled quietly until his death in 1380, leaving behind a kingdom reborn but not yet healed. The scars of plague, rebellion, and humiliation remained visible everywhere, from the shattered villages of Normandy to the blackened stones of Calais. France had survived, but survival came at a price. It no longer believed in glory. It believed only in endurance. The war was far from over, but the rhythm had changed. England's kings would soon look across the Channel again, hungry for what they had lost, and France, rebuilt, scarred, but alive, would face them not as a broken victim, but as something harder, colder, and wiser. The drums had returned. This time, they would not stop. The last years of Charles V's reign felt like the slow rebuilding of a cathedral after fire. Every stone replaced was a prayer, every repaired wall a defiance against oblivion. France was breathing again. What had once been a shattered kingdom, its fields black with plague, its nobles slain or fled, was now an organism learning to heal. The people did not speak of victory, but of recovery. The rhythm of life returned to the land. Bells rang again. Mills turned. Children were born who had never known the fear of plague pits or English patrols. And yet, the scars were everywhere. Every church had a corner where names were carved for the dead. Every village kept stories of fire and loss, as if they were heirlooms. France had survived. But survival was not peace, it was vigilance. Charles V understood that better than anyone. He ruled from the Louvre, not as a conqueror but as a caretaker. His kingdom had to be rebuilt brick by brick, law by law, mind by mind. He gathered scholars, engineers, and artists from every corner of Europe, turning Paris into the brain of a reborn nation. It was said that when Charles died, he would leave behind not a war hero, but the architect of France's soul. His generals, meanwhile, finished what he had begun. Bertrand du Guesclin, the rough soldier who had become the very image of French endurance, continued to reclaim lost lands. Du Guesclin was not elegant, but he was relentless. He waged war like erosion, steady, unstoppable, invisible, until the mountain was gone. He reclaimed Brittany not through open combat, but by cutting off English support and winning over local hearts. He liberated Anjou, Maine, and Poitou, with the patience of a man who understood that time itself could be a weapon. His troops fought differently from any generation before them. They were quiet, disciplined, and loyal to something larger than gold. They no longer saw themselves as servants of lords, but as sons of France. The banners of the fleur-de-lis no longer represented just a king, they represented endurance, the right to stand on one's own soil without bowing to foreign tongues. For the first time in living memory, France fought not for glory, but for belonging. England, by contrast, was unraveling. King Edward III, old and weary, ruled from memory rather than power. His court, once bright with ambition, had turned gray with debt and disease. His eldest son, the Black Prince, once the hero of Crécy, was dying slowly, his body eaten by illness. The English people, burdened by taxes to sustain their foreign war, began to wonder why they bled for lands across the sea when their own fields went untended. The English dream of empire was beginning to rot from within. When the Black Prince died in 1376, England lost more than a general, it lost its myth. A year later, Edward himself followed. The crown passed to a child, Richard II, a boy king too young to command and too old to be molded anew. Power fell into the hands of his uncles, of courtiers, of men who whispered louder than they listened. Across the Channel, Charles V watched and waited. France had no need to attack. Time would do the work. While England quarreled with itself, Du Guesclin tightened the noose. English garrisons found themselves stranded, unable to pay or feed their men. In one province after another, local lords abandoned their English overlords and returned to the French crown. Villages that had flown the Red Cross of St. George for a generation now raised the lilies once more. In 1370, the French retook Limoges. The English response was brutal. The Black Prince, then still living but broken in spirit, ordered the city burned. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered. It was a massacre meant to remind the world that England still had teeth. Instead, it reminded everyone that the lion was wounded and desperate. The moral tide had turned. The myth of English chivalry, once gilded in victory, now looked tarnished by cruelty. The French, who had once begged for mercy, began to see themselves as righteous in their vengeance. Du Guesclin's campaigns reached deep into the heart of Aquitaine, the jewel of England's continental empire. Towns fell without a fight. Even English soldiers began to mutter that perhaps their kings had asked too much of them. The war had become a memory too expensive to maintain. But Charles V did not seek to destroy England. He knew that pride destroyed itself faster than armies ever could. He avoided direct invasions and focused instead on fortifying France, its walls, its ports, its will. He was not merely reclaiming territory, he was reclaiming time. He rebuilt bridges, repaired fortresses, restored cathedrals, and most importantly, rebuilt faith. Not the blind faith of divine kingship, but the fragile human faith that a nation could survive its own suffering. He commissioned chronicles not of his victories, but of his people's endurance. In one, a monk from Rouen wrote, "The kingdom, though wounded and bled, shall endure as a body endures a scar. It tightens, hardens, and remembers." By 1376, France had regained most of the lands it had lost 40 years before. Calais remained in English hands, but even that victory had turned hollow. The great trade that had once flowed through it now bypassed its harbors. The English soldiers garrisoned there stared out to sea, homesick for a homeland that seemed to have forgotten them. When Du Guesclin died in 1380, France mourned him like a king. His coffin was carried across the countryside, and peasants knelt by the road as it passed. He was buried with honors fit for royalty, his sword laid upon his chest, his banner folded and placed beside him. On his tomb was written, "No heart beat stronger for France." 2 months later, Charles V followed him into the grave. The wise king was gone, the faithful knight laid to rest beside him. For a moment, it seemed as if God had finally allowed France to breathe. But history rarely lets the living rest. The kingdom that Charles and Du Guesclin had rebuilt stood strong, but it stood on foundations that were still fragile. Beneath the order they had crafted, the same forces that once tore France apart were waiting: ambition, madness, and pride. The next king, Charles VI, would inherit peace only to set it aflame again. For now, though, in the final quiet of 1380, France stood in the dusk light of recovery. Its fields were green again, its cities alive with song. The air that had once smelled of plague now smelled of bread, and in Paris, the great bells of Notre Dame rang not for mourning, but for survival. No one knew how brief that peace would be. Beyond the horizon, the embers of the old war still glowed, faint but waiting for air. In London, the boy King Richard II dreamed of restoring his grandfather's glory. In Burgundy, nobles whispered of power. And in the heart of France, beneath the crown of a fragile new monarch, the old sickness of pride began to stir again. The 100 Years' War was not finished. It was only catching its breath. The drums that Charles V left behind did not fall silent when he died. They only changed rhythm. In 1380, France crowned a boy of 11. His name was Charles VI, son of a wise king and heir to a fragile peace. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed that the wounds of a century were beginning to close. The harvests were steady, the rivers calm. The air no longer carried the smell of plague. But peace, like glass, holds until the first crack appears. Charles's early reign was ruled by others, his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Orléans, men who saw the crown not as a duty but as an inheritance to carve. They governed like wolves circling an unguarded lamb. Each believed himself the true shepherd of France. Each wanted more than the others. The people watched from below as the nobility turned the king's council into a marketplace of ambition. Taxes rose again, trade faltered, and the merchants who had rebuilt Paris after plague began to grumble that wisdom had died with the old king. The court feasted while the streets starved, but the boy king was kind. He listened, he learned, and he tried to be his father's son. He rode through Paris without armor, spoke softly to the poor, and wept at the sight of famine. The people called him Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved. For a while, hope returned. The banners fluttered above the Seine, trade reopened, and the French crown once again began to shine. But crowns, like iron, carry weight, and weight, when left too long, bends the mind. By his mid-20s, Charles began to change. It started with headaches fierce, blinding storms that came without warning. He would tremble, fall into silence for days, and emerge hollow-eyed, speaking of voices that no one else could hear. At first his courtiers whispered that he was exhausted, cursed, or bewitched. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Madness had come for the king. In the summer of 1392, while marching to punish a rebellious noble in Brittany, Charles rode at the head of his army through a dense forest. The day was sweltering. His men wore their armor open, their banners drooping in the heat. Suddenly, from the trees, a page dropped a lance. The clatter startled the horses. Charles's eyes went wide. He drew his sword, shouting, "They betray me!" and fell upon his own men. When his companions tried to restrain him, he turned on them too. By the time they disarmed him, several knights lay dead. When the frenzy passed, Charles collapsed, shaking. He did not recognize his own brother. That day, France lost her sanity with her king. Charles's fits became more frequent. At times, he forgot who he was entirely, wandering the halls of the Louvre, calling himself St. George or a shepherd. Once, he refused to bathe or change his clothes for months, convinced his flesh would crumble if touched. Another time, he declared that he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone came too near. The courtiers hid their fear behind ceremony. They bowed, smiled, and whispered prayers, but the kingdom was splintering. With the king unfit to rule, power fell again to his uncles and cousins, and their rivalries deepened into blood feuds. The court divided into two camps: the Armagnacs, loyal to the Duke of Orléans, and the Burgundians, loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. The peace Charles V had built with patience now dissolved in paranoia. The plague had once destroyed the body of France. Madness now consumed its mind. And across the Channel, England began to wake. The kingdom that had once seemed broken was finding new breath. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke seized the English throne from his cousin, Richard II, and crowned himself Henry IV. His rise was not noble, but necessary. England, weary of weak kings and costly wars, needed order. Henry gave it iron. Yet peace never lasts long in a land that dreams of crowns. The old longing for France still burned in English blood. Bards sang of Crécy, Calais, and the Black Prince as if they were yesterday. And among the young knights growing up in Henry's court, there was one who listened more closely than the rest, his son, Prince Hal. The boy was clever, restless, and reckless. He drank with thieves, fought in taverns, and mocked his tutors. The court whispered that he was unfit to rule, but those who fought beside him in tournaments said there was something in his eyes, something cold, calculating, and bright. He did not seek pleasure for its own sake. He was testing himself. England did not know it yet, but the sleeping lion was already stirring. While Henry IV struggled to keep his throne, France slipped further into chaos. The king's madness deepened. At times, he would recover clear-eyed, gentle, remorseful, and then, without warning, fall again into delirium. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, became regent, but her court was infamous for intrigue. She played the factions against each other, selling influence like coin. Paris turned against her, calling her the Bavarian witch. By 1407, the feud between the Armagnacs and Burgundians had turned to civil war. In November of that year, Louis, Duke of Orléans, was hacked to death in the streets of Paris by men loyal to his cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The king's own cousin had murdered his brother in cold blood. The city erupted. Churches burned, mobs rioted, and the Seine ran red. For the first time in decades, the blood spilled in Paris was French blood, shed not by invaders, but by brothers. It was a fracture no kingdom could survive alone, and England was watching. In 1413, Henry V ascended the English throne. The tavern prince was gone. In his place stood a commander born of chaos, sharpened by failure, and bound by faith. He united his nobles, silenced rebellion, and turned his eyes toward the continent. He believed that God had given him a divine right to the French crown, a claim once made by Edward III, now reborn in him. And across the Channel, France seemed ripe for the taking. Its king was insane, its nobles at war, its cities starving. Henry saw not a nation, but an opportunity written in scripture and ambition. He began to build an army unlike any since his ancestors' time, disciplined, devout, and ruthless. The English shipyards filled with sails again. The forges glowed red through the night, and the longbows were taken down from the rafters where they had hung since Crécy. War was waking. The 100 Years' War had been smoldering for decades, burning low beneath the ashes of plague and peace. Now, in 1415, Henry's ships gathered in the harbors of Southampton. Above them, the wind carried the same scent it had in his great-grandfather's time: salt, iron, and destiny. The sleeping lion had opened its eyes. And in France, a mad king stared at his reflection and saw not himself, but 1,000 ghosts waiting for him on the battlefield. The year was 1415. England had found its king again. Henry V was 28, young, devout, unyielding. To his subjects he was not a man, but an answer. The one who would restore England's glory, cleanse its sins, and reclaim what his ancestors had begun. In his veins ran the old fire of Edward III and the cold precision of a commander born for purpose. He spoke little. He prayed often. And when he prayed, his men said, the room itself seemed to listen. France, across the Channel, was a broken mirror, its shards glittering but deadly. The mad King Charles VI still sat on the throne, drifting in and out of delusion. His wife Isabeau ruled through intrigue. The Duke of Burgundy plotted in shadows, and the Armagnacs, sworn enemies of Burgundy, claimed to defend the crown even as they tore it apart. The kingdom was less a state than a storm. To Henry, this chaos was divine invitation. He claimed descent through his great-grandfather Edward III and demanded the French crown. The French diplomats laughed. They offered him money, land, titles, everything but legitimacy. Henry replied not with words, but with ships. In August, his fleet, over 1,500 vessels, sailed from Southampton, their sails swelling with wind and prophecy. The horizon disappeared behind the mass of white canvas and red crosses. The sea that separated England from France had never looked narrower. When they landed at Harfleur, Henry's invasion began not with thunder, but with hunger. The city was well fortified, its walls thick, and its defenders stubborn. The siege dragged on for 5 weeks under relentless heat. Disease crept through the English camps. Dysentery. The soldiers called it the bloody flux. Men who had crossed the sea for glory now lay dying in ditches, their armor rusting around them. Henry did not retreat. He walked among his men, unarmed, unmasked, his boots caked in mud and blood. He promised them that every ounce of suffering would be remembered in heaven. He was not a king of comfort. He was a king of conviction. When Harfleur finally surrendered, the gates opened not to cheers, but to silence. The English soldiers entered the city like ghosts. Inside, the streets reeked of rot. Half the population was dead. Henry ordered no pillage, only prayers. He left a garrison behind and turned north toward Calais, the same path his great-grandfather had once taken to glory. But the march would not be easy. Autumn rains soaked the countryside. Roads turned to rivers of mud. Food ran low. Disease followed them still. The army that had landed 12,000 strong was now barely half that. And waiting for them ahead, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, was the French host nearly 6 times their number. The French nobles, divided for decades, had finally found something they could agree on. The English had to die. The Dukes of Orléans, Alençon, and Bourbon, along with the Constable of France, gathered under the lilies. Their banners filled the fields near Agincourt, a small village surrounded by plowed farmland, narrow and soft from rain. To them, Henry was a thief come to steal their inheritance. They would bury him in French mud before dawn. But Henry knew the ground better than they did. He saw the narrow valley, the churned earth, the dense woods on either side, and he smiled. It was Crécy all over again, only wetter. The French would not be able to use their cavalry. Their armor would sink into the mire, their numbers would choke their own advance. The night before battle, Henry's army camped in the open fields. The rain fell without mercy. The soldiers, too weary to speak, sharpened arrows in the mud by candlelight. Some prayed, some cursed, some stared into the darkness, listening to the wind that carried the sound of distant laughter from the French tents. Across the field, the French nobles drank wine and argued over who would capture the English king and how much ransom he would bring. They sent heralds with challenges, formal invitations to a slaughter, but Henry sent no reply. He knew that morning would speak for him. In the early hours of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, the rain stopped. A mist hung over the valley. The fields, soaked and soft, glistened like oil. Henry rose before dawn, heard mass by torchlight, and mounted his horse. He rode down the lines, not with pomp but with purpose. He looked at the faces of his archers, farmers, cobblers, shepherds, and nodded. They nodded back. That was enough. The longbowmen took their positions at the flanks, driving sharpened stakes into the mud to ward off cavalry. Each man carried 24 arrows fletched with goose feathers, each arrowhead designed to pierce plate. They stood ankle-deep in filth, their hands steady. The French, resplendent in their armor, advanced with banners high. Trumpets blared. Their commanders believed the English would break at the sight of them. But the sound that answered was different, a low hum, like the drawing of breath. Then came the first volley. 10,000 arrows rose into the gray sky and fell like rain. The air sang with death. Horses screamed. Men fell. The mud swallowed them whole. The French ranks collided, stumbled, suffocated under their own weight. The longbows did not stop. Arrow after arrow, rhythm without mercy. The valley became a pit of steel and flesh. The battle was short and apocalyptic. By noon, the French nobility, half the lords of France, lay dead or captured. The English losses numbered in the hundreds. The fields of Agincourt were so thick with armor and bodies that one chronicler wrote, "You could cross from one end to the other without setting foot on earth." When Henry walked among the fallen, he did not smile. He prayed. The victory was total, but not glorious. It was proof of something darker, that faith, discipline, and desperation could break the proudest of men. That night, the surviving English lit no fires. The battlefield steamed beneath a pale moon. The rain began again, washing the blood into the soil. Henry stood alone by his tent, listening. He knew that this victory would echo for centuries, but it would also bind him to something he could never escape. Because every crown carved by fire burns the hand that wears it. He had won the impossible. France was broken. Paris trembled. The lilies had fallen to the lion once more. But even lions must rest. And in the silence after Agincourt, something fragile stirred, something that would rise from the ashes of defeat and change the war forever. Her name was Jean. Before dawn on October 25th, 1415, the valley of Agincourt was a sea of mist. No banners yet flew, no horns yet called, only the soft shuffle of boots in the mud and the slow exhale of 1,000 men waiting for judgment. To the English soldiers, exhausted, fevered, half-starved, it felt like the world itself had shrunk to this narrow strip of farmland between two walls of dripping forest. Behind them, the road to Calais. Ahead, the mass of the French host, vast as the tide. Some men prayed, others stared at their trembling hands, wondering if God still listened after so many years of war. Henry V rode among them. His armor was plain, his crown replaced by a simple circlet of steel. He was not a distant king now, but a soldier among soldiers. He passed no speeches. His eyes met theirs, one by one, until silence became courage. The French army outnumbered the English 5-1. They glittered in polished armor, bright as mirrors beneath the rising Sunday. Nobles, dukes, and barons crowded the field, each eager to reclaim his family's honor, each believing victory already his. They called it a hunt, not a battle. The prey, they said, was cornered, but the field itself betrayed them. The land near Agincourt was soft clay plowed only weeks before. A night of heavy rain had turned it to a swamp. The French, armored head to heel in steel, would sink with every step. Henry saw it and smiled. As the fog lifted, he ordered his men forward. The English archers drove wooden stakes into the ground, at an angle rows of jagged teeth pointing outward. Between them stood men-at-arms, 3 ranks deep, mud to their knees, faces pale with exhaustion but fixed with something colder than fear. Focus. At the center of the French lines, trumpets blared. A sound like thunder rolled across the field. Thousands of hooves tore into the mud. The French cavalry surged forward, wave upon wave of steel and arrogance. The ground shuddered. The English line stood still. Then, with a single raised hand, Henry gave the signal. The sky turned black. A storm of arrows rose like a living thing, tens of thousands, released in one breath. The sound was not a whistle, but a hiss, like rain cutting through wind. When they fell, the world cracked open. Horses reared. Men screamed, banners twisted and vanished in chaos. The first French charge broke before it reached the line. Riders fell, crushed by their own mounts, speared by the very stakes meant to stop them. Arrows pierced joints, visors, the gaps behind knees and under arms. The fallen became obstacles. Those behind stumbled over them. The mud swallowed all equally. Henry's archers moved methodically. They drew, loosed, drew again, each man a rhythm, each shot a heartbeat. When their arrows ran low, they reached for the knives at their belts and waited. The second French wave advanced on foot, thousands of armored knights trudging through the mire. Their boots sank deeper with every step. The weight of their armor turned the soil into a trap. They came not as an army, but as individuals struggling through quicksand, breathing heavy under the weight of pride. When they finally reached the English line, the collision was slow, suffocating, and merciless. Swords clanged against helmets. Men slipped and fell, unable to rise. The archers dropped their bows, picked up axes and mallets, and joined the slaughter. It was no longer a battle between nobles, it was a butcher's work. The French fought bravely, but the field fought against them. Those behind pressed forward, crushing those in front. Horses and men mixed in heaps of screaming flesh. Chroniclers later wrote that the dead lay piled higher than a man's chest. Henry himself fought in the thick of it, his surcoat torn, his visor dented. At one point, a French knight struck his crown, splitting it. Blood ran down his face, but he did not fall. He pressed forward, swinging, his sword glinting with mud and rain. In that moment, he was not a king, he was the edge of England's will. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds. What it revealed was not victory, but carnage. The French army, noble and mighty, was gone. Thousands lay dead or dying, their armor glinting like scales of some slain beast. The English stood silent among them, too stunned to cheer. Only the wind moved, stirring torn banners and scattering feathers from spent arrows. Henry walked the field, his boots sinking in the blood-soaked clay. Everywhere he looked, he saw faces, some familiar, some forgotten. Knights who had laughed at him now stared skyward with open eyes, unseeing. The air stank of iron and mud. The silence was heavier than the fight had been. He ordered prayers for the dead enemy and friend alike. Then he gave the command no one expected. The captured nobles were to be executed. It was not cruelty, it was calculation. The battle was not yet secure, and thousands of French soldiers remained nearby. If they rallied while his men guarded prisoners, they would all die. The order was grim, but necessary. So the English archers, men who had once been farmers and shepherds, turned to the wounded knights and did their duty. The cries that followed echoed longer than the clash of arms. By evening, the valley was quiet again. The rain returned, light at first, then steady. It washed the blood into the soil and turned the ground into something softer, something forgetful. The English lit no fires. They sat in the dark, wrapped in cloaks, staring at the shapes of the fallen. The French nobility was shattered, thousands dead, including the Constable of France, the Dukes of Alençon and Brabant, and nearly every commander of note. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down in a single day. One chronicler wrote, "There lay the pride of France, and the earth drank deep." Henry's army, though small, had achieved the impossible. They had stood against overwhelming odds and survived. Yet as the night wore on, the victory felt less like triumph and more like confession. The fields of Agincourt had become a mirror showing the price of ambition. The next morning, Henry gathered his men and ordered the banners raised. The lilies of France, torn from fallen standards, were carried beside the Red Cross of England. The wind caught them both. No one could tell which flag looked more tattered. When they marched toward Calais, the soldiers did not sing. They walked in silence, their boots sinking into the same mud that had swallowed kings and dreams alike. Behind them, the field of Agincourt was left to the crows. A French poet would later write, "We thought the ground was ours, it was theirs. We thought we were lions, they were the storm." For Henry, Agincourt was not an ending. It was an opening act. France lay broken, its government divided, its armies destroyed. Within a few years, he would march again not as an invader, but as a claimant to the throne of France itself. But victories have shadows. The same mud that crowned him also buried something deeper: mercy, restraint, and the fragile humanity that war devours. What began as glory would end as grief. The 100 Years' War had reached its bloodiest miracle. The lion had conquered the lilies. But across the charred ruins of France, amid smoke and silence, a whisper began to rise of faith, of fire, of a girl who would one day lift a sword in God's name. Her time was coming. When the fields of Agincourt faded behind him, Henry V left more than a battlefield. He left a graveyard large enough to bury an age. The French nobility had been broken. Sons who had dreamed of songs and titles now lay faceless beneath the mud. The bloodline of chivalry, centuries old, was gone in a single morning. Even the victors felt haunted by what they had done. The English army marched through the countryside in silence, their boots sucking at the soil that had drunk too much of both nations. But Henry saw only purpose. He believed Agincourt was not merely a victory, it was proof. Proof that God's favor rested upon England. Proof that the chaos of France was divine invitation. The path ahead was no longer conquest. It was coronation. In the years that followed, he turned that faith into iron. By 1417, he returned to Normandy with an army stronger, richer, and colder. No longer a desperate band of archers and farmers, but a machine of siege and order. Town after town fell. Rouen resisted for 6 months before hunger forced surrender. Chroniclers said that the starving citizens ate cats, dogs, even grass, before opening the gates. Henry ordered food distributed to the survivors, but the message was clear. Resistance was futile. He did not burn cities. He absorbed them. Every stronghold taken was garrisoned, every church spared, every tax exacted. His campaign was not chaos, it was administration. France was being remade in England's image. The French court, divided and leaderless, could do nothing. King Charles VI wandered in and out of madness, whispering to empty corners. His queen, Isabeau, shifted allegiance to whoever promised safety. The Duke of Burgundy, once France's greatest noble, chose to ally with the English rather than the Armagnac faction that had killed his father. France was no longer fighting England, it was fighting itself. In 1419, a final spark of hope flared and died. The young Dauphin Charles, the king's son, met with the Duke of Burgundy to reconcile their factions. It could have ended the civil war, but in a moment of panic or treachery, Burgundian loyalists stabbed the Duke to death on the bridge at Montereau. The blood of Burgundy spilled onto the stones, and the wound never healed. In revenge, the new Duke, Philip the Good, swore allegiance to Henry V. France's last shield fell. By 1420, the English king marched into Troyes at the head of a victorious army. The air was thick with incense and ash. The French court, desperate and cornered, agreed to what seemed unthinkable, a peace that erased their own heir. Under the Treaty of Troyes, Henry V was recognized as regent and heir to the throne of France. He married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the Mad King. Their child would inherit both crowns. England and France were to become one empire under one ruler. The wedding was quiet, held in the shadow of smoke still rising from distant towns. Chroniclers wrote that Henry smiled only once when the crown of France was placed above his head, and he whispered a single phrase, "God's will be done." He had achieved what no king before him had dared to dream. But even kings are mortal. The empire he built was not of stone, but of bone and breath. And breath can fail. In 1421, while campaigning deep in France, Henry fell ill, perhaps dysentery, perhaps exhaustion. He refused to rest, commanding his armies even from his cot. He wrote letters to England, to Catherine, to his unborn son, describing plans for the final unification of the kingdoms. But the letters stopped coming. On August 31st, 1422, Henry V died at the age of 35. The man who had conquered two nations never saw them united. 2 months later, Charles VI of France also died, his mind lost long before his breath. And so, by the letter of the treaty, the infant Henry VI, a baby not yet 1 year old, became king of both England and France. The world bowed to a cradle. At first, the illusion held. English banners flew over Paris. English governors ruled Normandy. Coins were minted with the words Henricus, Rex Angliae et Franciae Henry, King of England and France. The chroniclers called it the dream of empire. But dreams fade. Without Henry's will to bind it, the empire began to fray. The English lords argued over taxes, titles, and control. The French saw not unity, but occupation. What had been a conquest of faith became a rule of fear. Beneath the surface, rebellion simmered. The common people whispered of a prophecy that a woman, blessed by God, would rise to save France. No one believed it. Not yet. But the rumor spread like wildfire through villages, through convents, through the broken hearts of those who had nothing left but faith. The English soldiers garrisoned in northern towns heard it too, mocking it as tavern superstition. They laughed, but they locked their doors tighter at night. Paris, under English control, was a city without joy. The churches were full, but the prayers were hollow. The black flags of mourning for the old king hung beside the red crosses of the occupiers. The Seine carried whispers rather than song. Somewhere in the countryside, a girl was watching all of this unfold. She had no noble blood, no army, no name beyond her own, but she had a conviction that burned brighter than any torch. She had never seen Agincourt, but she had heard the stories of mud, of death, of God's silence, and she wondered if perhaps God had simply been waiting for someone else to listen. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. The England Henry V left behind had inherited his crown but not his fire. His commanders Bedford, Warwick, Salisbury were soldiers of duty, not destiny. They held the lines, collected taxes, and fortified castles. But they did not inspire. They ruled as caretakers of a legacy that had already begun to crumble. For every town they held, another rose in rebellion. For every French noble that swore allegiance, another turned against them. The tide of faith was shifting, not through armies or treaties, but through whispers, visions, and something the English could neither understand nor kill: hope. By 1428, the English siege of Orléans marked the high water mark of their power. The city stood on the edge of the Loire, like a beacon, surrounded but unbroken. If Orléans fell, France would fall with it. If it held, the war might yet turn. And in that moment of desperation, when kings were mad and princes were dead, when the lilies of France seemed ready to vanish forever, she arrived. A teenage girl in peasant clothes, claiming to hear the voice of God. The soldiers laughed. The generals dismissed her. The clergy questioned her. But the people listened, because after 100 years of war, they no longer needed kings. They needed faith. And faith sometimes comes wearing armor too large for its shoulders. The wind that once carried the arrows of Agincourt now carried her voice. It swept across France like a forgotten hymn, and for the first time in a century, the land stirred not in fear, but in hope. The 100 Years' War was entering its final act, and its savior was not born in a castle, but in a village. The village of Domremy was small enough to fit inside a dream. It lay on the edge of France like a secret half-meadow, half-shadow, where the river Meuse curved through forests older than memory. The war had passed by it for years, leaving only rumors and ashes. Yet somehow, life persisted. Cows still grazed, bells still rang, and children still played among the ruins of forgotten walls. Among them was a girl named Jean. She was not born into history. She was born into silence. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer and minor official. Her mother, Isabelle, taught her to spin, to pray, and to endure. They were peasants honest, weary, invisible, the sort of people whose names the chronicles rarely remembered. But if history forgets the poor, heaven sometimes does not. When Jean was 13, she said the air began to speak. She was in her father's garden, the light shifting through the apple trees, when she heard it, a voice clear and warm, neither man nor woman, carrying a peace so vast it frightened her. Later she would say, it was St. Michael, then St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. To her it did not matter who they were, only that they were real. They told her that France was dying, and that she, a girl of no rank, was chosen to help save it. She said yes. The world around her did not. For years, she carried the secret like a wound. The war grew worse. The English tightened their grip on the north. The Dauphin Charles VII, son of the mad king, had fled to the south, ruling a kingdom of swamps and shadows. His people called him the king without a crown. France had lost its armies, its courage, even its faith. But Jean's belief only deepened. Every morning she prayed at the chapel of St. Catherine, asking for guidance. Every night she watched the fires on the horizon, the English patrols, the burning villages, and wondered how long heaven would wait. When the voices told her to go to Vaucouleurs, a nearby garrison loyal to the Dauphin, she obeyed. She was 16. She had no weapon, no escort, and no permission, only conviction. The captain at Vaucouleurs, Robert de Baudricourt, laughed when she asked for an audience with the Dauphin. A girl, he said, saving France, but she did not leave. Day after day, she returned to the gates, her eyes clear, her voice calm. I must go, she told him, for it is God's will. Finally, perhaps out of pity or exhaustion, Baudricourt agreed. He gave her a small escort and a horse. Jean cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothing for protection, and set out on a 12-day journey through enemy territory. The roads of winter 1429 were more dangerous than any battlefield. Bandits, soldiers, and deserters roamed freely. The air smelled of smoke and fear. Yet the girl from Domremy rode through it all without harm. Her companions later swore they felt protected by something unseen, something that walked beside her in the night. When she arrived at Chinon, the Dauphin's court was not a palace but a ruin. The walls cracked, the windows boarded, the air thick with hopelessness. Charles himself was hesitant, weary, uncertain even of his own right to rule. He had lived half his life in retreat, surrounded by flatterers and cowards. To him, heaven had been silent for a long time. Then the peasant girl appeared. She asked for an audience. The courtiers laughed, but Charles, curious or desperate, agreed to test her. He dressed himself as a common noble and hid among his men. When Jean entered the hall, she paused only a moment before walking straight to him, kneeling and saying, God give you long life, gentle Dauphin. No one could explain how she knew him. Charles asked her why she had come. She answered, "To raise the siege of Orleans and to see you crowned at Reims." Her voice did not tremble. For a moment, the hall went silent, as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. She was 16 years old, covered in mud from the road, speaking to a prince who no longer believed in miracles, and yet, for reasons no one could name, he believed her. The church demanded proof. Priests and scholars examined her for weeks, questioning her visions, testing her knowledge. They found no heresy, no madness, only purity and conviction. One confessor wrote, "This child knows more of faith than a university of men." Charles gave her a banner instead of a sword, a white field embroidered with lilies, with the names of Jesus and Mary. When she took it in her hands, witnesses said her face changed, as if lit from within. In April 1429, she rode to Orleans at the head of a small column of soldiers. The same generals who mocked her now followed her, half out of curiosity, half out of awe. As they passed through the countryside, peasants came running from the fields, falling to their knees as she went by. They called her La Pucelle the Maid. Her army was small, but her presence was immense. Where she went, the air seemed lighter. Soldiers stopped swearing. Men who had deserted returned. Priests blessed her as if she were already canonized. Even the birds, one chronicler claimed, sang louder when she rode beneath the trees. To the English, she was madness made flesh. To the French, she was the answer to a century of prayers. When she reached the city, Orleans had been under siege for nearly 7 months. The English held strong points on all sides, strangling the town like a tightening rope. Supplies were running out. Hope had already left. The people, upon hearing of her approach, rang the bells of every church. It was the sound of faith being reborn. Jean entered the city by night, her banner glowing in torchlight. The citizens lined the streets, crying and shouting her name. She told them simply, "Have no fear. God is with us." And for the first time in 100 years, France began to believe it. When Jean entered Orleans, the city was already half in the grave. Its walls trembled from cannon fire. Its streets reeked of smoke and despair. For months the English had tightened their noose, encircling the city with forts and towers, wooden monsters planted in the soil of France. The people called them les Bastilles, the cages. Inside, the enemy watched, patient as wolves. The French commanders were exhausted. They had fought for survival, not victory. And when they looked upon the young girl in armor, barely 17, her banner white as bone, they saw not a warrior, but a miracle wearing human shape. That night, Jean prayed in the Cathedral of Sainte Croix. The air was cold, filled with the breath of hundreds who had come to see her kneel. She said nothing, only wept quietly beneath the flickering candles. Those who stood nearby swore they felt something shift in the room, as if the stones themselves were listening. At dawn, the bells rang, not for death this time, but for defiance. Jean rode to the eastern gate, her banner fluttering like fire. The English forts loomed ahead, massive timber walls bristling with spears and arrows. The generals begged caution. She answered only, "They will fall before night." And then she led the charge. The assault on the Tourelles fortress began in chaos. The French advanced across the narrow bridge under a storm of arrows and stones. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of pitch. Men screamed, horses plunged, the river ran red. Jean rode among them, holding her banner high. She never drew her sword. Her weapon was sight, the sight of her refusing to fall. A crossbow bolt struck her shoulder. The steel head drove deep, blood pouring down her arm. The soldiers cried out that she was dead. For a moment, the attack faltered. Then, slowly, she rose again. The sun caught her banner, and the white cloth blazed against the smoke. She called out not a battle cry, but a prayer. "In God's name, forward!" The line surged. The wounded girl at their head became a storm no man could stop. By evening, the English banners were torn down. The fortress fell. From the ramparts, the people of Orleans watched as the lilies of France rose again above the river. Bells rang across the city until the sound blurred into weeping. The siege that had lasted 7 months ended in a single day. The soldiers called her the Maid of Orleans. To the people, she was something greater, a reminder that God had not forgotten France. Word of her victory spread like wildfire. In towns and villages across the Loire, peasants left their plows and picked up spears. Soldiers who had deserted returned to the banners. Even the skeptical generals began to speak her name with reverence. She had turned despair into momentum. In a war that had lasted almost a century, that was a greater miracle than any vision. But Jean's mission was not yet complete. Her voices had promised more than a single victory. They had promised a crown. And to crown a king, she said, they must march to Reims, the ancient city of coronation, deep within enemy lines. The idea was madness. Reims lay far to the north, guarded by strongholds still loyal to England and Burgundy. To reach it, they would have to cross a land that had belonged to death for generations. Yet Jean would not yield. "If I am not afraid," she said, "why should you be?" In June 1429, she led the army north. City after city opened its gates without a fight. The sight of her banner was enough to make garrisons surrender. No treaty, no threat, only faith. It was as if France herself had awakened and remembered who she was. On July 16th, they reached Reims. The gates opened. The people poured into the streets, shouting, "Noel, Noel, long live the king!" The cathedral bells, silent for years, burst into life. The next morning, Charles was anointed with holy oil, crowned King Charles VII of France. Jean stood beside him, her banner raised. She wept through the entire ceremony. When asked later why, she said, "It was the fulfillment of what I was sent to do." For a brief moment, France felt whole again. But destiny rarely ends where we wish. The English still held Paris. Burgundy still plotted revenge. The church still questioned her. Jean, once the symbol of divine favor, began to threaten the very men she had saved. A peasant girl who could command armies unsettled the proud. Her victories made kings look small. That autumn, she begged to continue the campaign to strike Paris, to drive out the occupiers completely. But Charles hesitated. He had his crown now, and the court preferred peace to glory. They delayed, they debated, they doubted. And for the first time, Jeanne began to feel alone. When the attack on Paris finally came, it was half-hearted and doomed. She led the charge, as always, carrying her banner. She was struck again, this time in the thigh, and pulled from the field as her army retreated. Paris remained English. Her star began to dim, yet even in failure, she never faltered. In letters sent to her hometown, she wrote not of sorrow, but of faith. "Though men make war," she said, "it is God who gives victory." The English and Burgundians called her a witch, a heretic, a fraud. The people called her a saint. Somewhere between the two, history waited, watching. By the end of 1429, the war had changed. The English were no longer conquerors. They were occupiers. The French, once broken, now believed again. And belief, once born, cannot be killed by steel. Jeanne's presence had done what armies could not. She had given France its soul back. Even those who doubted her could not deny what she had set in motion. In a century ruled by kings and killers, a teenage girl had shifted the axis of a continent. The world did not yet know how high her flame would rise, or how soon it would be extinguished. But in that summer of victory, as the bells of Reims echoed across the valleys, the people believed that perhaps, at last, the war might end. They were wrong. For every saint, there is a pyre waiting in the distance. And Jeanne, the Maid of Orleans, was already walking toward hers. Victory, once so radiant, fades faster than any flame. In the summer of 1429, France had believed again. The lilies flew once more, the bells sang across the valleys, and the people spoke the name of Jeanne d'Arc with awe. But faith is fragile, and politics is patient. While peasants saw her as God's messenger, princes saw her as a problem. The coronation at Reims had made Charles VII a king, but it also made him cautious. He feared his own generals, his own allies, and perhaps most of all the girl who had done what they could not. Jeanne's purity was a mirror, and in it, the court saw their own corruption reflected. She asked for one thing only, to keep fighting. Paris still wore the English cross. Burgundy still held the north. She begged Charles to march. He delayed. The courtiers whispered that she had served her purpose, that God's voice had gone silent. The king smiled politely and sent her away. But Jean did not know how to rest. In early 1430, she rode north with a small band of loyal men. No royal banner, no grand army, just faith, once again her only armor. She went to Compiègne, a city besieged by the Burgundians. She entered under cover of night, slipping through enemy lines. The people rejoiced. They believed salvation had come again. For a few days, it seemed true. Jean led sorties against the enemy, driving them back with audacity that bordered on madness. Arrows filled the air. Cannon smoke cloaked the fields. But wherever her banner flew, courage followed. Then, on May 23rd, it ended. During a skirmish outside the walls, her forces were overwhelmed. The drawbridge was raised too soon. Jean turned to retreat, but the gates closed behind her. She was trapped. Surrounded by Burgundian soldiers, she fought until her horse was pulled down and she was dragged into the mud. The city watched from the ramparts as their savior was taken. They said the sky went gray that afternoon, as if the sun itself could not bear witness. Jean was sold like spoil of war. The Burgundians, knowing her worth, ransomed her to the English for 10,000 livres, the price of a princess. The English rejoiced not for victory, but for vengeance. For years she had humiliated them, defied their armies, mocked their certainty. Now she would answer for it. They brought her to Rouen, the English stronghold in Normandy, and placed her in a cell of cold stone. No sunlight, no prayer, no friendly voice. She was chained day and night, guarded by men who feared her even in silence. Some refused to look her in the eye. The church came next. Or rather, men who wore its robes but not its mercy. The Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, a Frenchman in English pay, arranged a trial meant not to seek truth, but to destroy it. Jean was accused of heresy, witchcraft, arrogance, and disobedience. They called her the devil's bride, a fraud who dared to speak God's name. They asked her why she wore men's clothing. She said, "Because it is safer." They asked her why she claimed to hear voices. She said, "Because I do." They asked her if she believed God had sent her. She said, "If he had not, he would not have given me the strength to do what I have done." Each answer confounded them. They expected madness or confession, not calm defiance. A farmer's daughter, alone and uneducated, stood before scholars, priests, and lords, and none of them could make her lie. The trial dragged on for months. Winter turned to spring. Outside the walls of Rouen, France bled and England faltered. But inside that dark hall, the last battle of faith and fear was being fought by a single girl. At night, the guards whispered that they saw her praying for them. Some claimed her cell glowed faintly, like moonlight through glass. Others spat and crossed themselves. Even her enemies felt unease, as if they were not condemning a heretic, but crucifying hope itself. In May 1431, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by fire. On the morning of May 30th, they led her to the marketplace. The crowd was vast: soldiers, priests, peasants, even children lifted onto shoulders to see. She wore a simple white dress. Her hands were bound. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. When they tied her to the stake, she asked for a cross. A sympathetic soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She kissed it and held it close. Then she asked that a crucifix be raised high so she could see it as the flames rose. The fire was lit. At first there was only smoke, thick and bitter. Then came the light. Witnesses said she called upon God until her voice was lost in the roar. One English soldier wept openly and said, "We have burned a saint." When it was over, nothing remained but ashes and a heart that refused to burn. They scattered it into the Seine, hoping the river would wash her memory away. But rivers remember. News of her death spread through France like thunder. The people mourned not just for her, but for what she had meant. The dream of deliverance, the belief that even in ruin, God still spoke. And somehow, her death gave that dream new life. For within a year, the French armies, once leaderless and defeated, began to fight again. Not for kings or crowns, but for the Maid. Her name became their banner. Her faith became their weapon. The English, who had ruled with iron, began to slip. Every town they took cost them 10 to hold. Every victory felt hollow. The Burgundians, once allies, drifted away. Even Paris began to whisper of rebellion. Jean's body was gone, but her spirit had set the wind aflame. In time, Charles VII, once hesitant, now hardened by guilt, reclaimed Paris, Normandy, and the north. He walked again into Rouen, the city where she had died, and ordered an inquiry into her trial. The judges found only lies and greed. He did not speak when the verdict was read. He only bowed his head. The 100 Years' War was burning itself out. England's empire in France was a shadow of what it had been. Yet even as the armies faded, the memory of one girl endured like smoke that never quite disappears. History calls her saint, warrior, martyr, miracle. But the truth is simpler. She was a child who believed that faith could move nations. And for a brief, shining moment, it did. After the smoke of Rouen faded, the war did not stop. It only changed shape. The girl who had carried France's faith to the stake left behind something neither armies nor kings could destroy: conviction. Jean's ashes had been scattered into the Seine, but her spirit rose with the river mist, spreading across the valleys and the villages like a ghost that refused to rest. The English could not see it, but they could feel it. Their garrisons in Normandy grew quiet. Supply ships came slower each month. Soldiers drank more, prayed less, and stared too long at the forests where French partisans moved like shadows. The locals, who once bowed, now glared in silence. The land itself seemed to turn against them. By 1435, the alliance that had kept England strong began to crumble. The Burgundians, whose betrayal had once condemned Jean, made peace with Charles VII in the Treaty of Arras. France, long divided by feud and faith, was one again. For the first time in a century, the French king could call himself ruler of a united realm and mean it. The English, still clinging to their castles and their pride, called it treason. The French called it deliverance. Then came the reconquest. It did not happen in one grand battle, but in a slow, relentless tide. Charles's armies, newly trained, newly paid, and newly faithful, advanced with patience that mirrored their king's newfound calm. No longer were they the ragged bands of peasants led by visions. They were soldiers, professional and purposeful. They fought not for glory, but for home. Normandy, once England's richest jewel, fell piece by piece. In 1449, the campaign began. The following year, Rouen, the city that had watched Jeanne burn, surrendered to the French without a siege. The bells that had once tolled for her death now rang for her vengeance. The English commander, faced with overwhelming odds, asked for honorable terms. The French granted them, but the people did not forget. They lined the streets as the English troops marched out silent, unarmed, their banners trailing in the mud. One chronicler wrote, "The wind blew from the west that day, and it carried away the lion's roar." From Normandy, the tide moved south. Caen, Cherbourg, Honfleur, all fell in quick succession. Even the sea could not save them. English ships watched helplessly from the Channel as the ports they had built over generations slipped back into French hands. The great dream of an Anglo-French empire, born in the mind of Edward III and sealed in the blood of Agincourt, was dying in silence. In Gascony, the last English stronghold, they fought with the desperation of memory. The vineyards that had once filled London's cups now burned. The merchants who had grown rich from Bordeaux wine now watched their casks float downriver, aflame. In 1453, the final blow came at the Battle of Castillon. It was not a clash of knights and banners, but of cannons. The age of chivalry that had begun at Crécy ended here, in smoke and thunder. The English commander, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, was 70 years old, a relic of another time. He led his men with the same courage that had once won empires, but courage could not stop gunpowder. When the French guns opened fire, the earth itself seemed to shatter. Talbot fell beside his son, their bodies crushed beneath the collapse of a wooden fort. By dusk, the last English army in France was gone. Bordeaux surrendered without another fight. 116 years of war had come to its end. France, exhausted and scarred, stood among the ruins and listened to the quiet. The kingdom had survived plague, madness, betrayal, and fire. It had been ruled by children, saints, and lunatics, and still it endured. Charles VII, once the hesitant Dauphin, now walked through the halls of his recovered castles with the calm of a man who had seen too much to celebrate. He restored law, rebuilt bridges, reopened universities. The same hands that had crowned him because of Jeanne now rebuilt the country she had died for. He never spoke her name in public, but her presence lingered in every act of mercy, every church rebuilt, every bell that rang for peace instead of war. Across the Channel, England mourned in silence. The glory that had once stretched from Calais to Bordeaux was reduced to a single port and 1,000 empty graves. The treasury was empty, the army disillusioned, the people restless. A new generation asked why they had fought so long for a crown that no longer fit. In 1455, 2 years after the loss of France, England turned its swords inward. The Wars of the Roses began a struggle between cousins, between red and white, between the memory of empire and the hunger for power. The 100 Years' War had not only broken France, it had hollowed England. Its kings had dreamed of thrones and woken to ruins. The chronicles say that in Normandy, long after the last battle, villagers still found rusted armor buried in the fields. Sometimes it was French, sometimes English. By then, it hardly mattered. The earth had claimed them both. One such story tells of a farmer near Formigny, plowing his field in spring. His blade struck something hard. He dug, and there in the mud lay a broken sword, its edge eaten by rust, its hilt engraved with the faint outline of a lion. He wiped it clean, looked at it for a moment, then placed it upright in the soil and left it there half buried, half standing. Through summer and rain, it remained, a monument no king had ordered, no mason had carved. Children would pass it and whisper that it belonged to the English, or perhaps to a ghost, but the old men would shake their heads and say, "It belongs to the war." And when the sun set over Normandy, the light would strike that blade just enough for it to glimmer, faintly, like a memory refusing to die. That was how the 100 Years' War ended, not with triumph, but with exhaustion, not with victory songs, but with silence. The world it had burned was gone. In its place stood nations stronger, harder, older. The age of knights and banners had given way to something colder. Gunpowder, bureaucracy, standing armies, the slow machinery of modern power. But somewhere beneath all that iron and ambition, beneath the crowns and treaties, there still lingered the echo of a girl's voice, calling across the centuries, "France will rise." And it did. The war had ended, but peace never came. In 1453, when the last English garrison surrendered in Gascony, the soldiers who returned across the Channel brought nothing home, no treasure, no triumph, only ghosts. The banners of England, once carried proudly through France, now hung limp in the fog of their own shores. 100 years of conquest had left the kingdom not greater, but hollow. The first thing to die was wealth. The fields of Kent and Yorkshire, once green with wool that had fed the war machine, lay untended. The trade routes with Bordeaux and Rouen were gone, the ports silent except for the cry of gulls. The merchants who had financed kings now counted their losses instead of their coins. Prices rose, wages fell, and famine, England's oldest enemy, crept back into the villages. Then, slowly, something deeper began to rot. The people had changed. A generation that had never known peace could not remember what it meant to live without an enemy. The soldiers who came home found no welcome. Their hands knew only how to kill, not to sew. They wandered from town to town, selling their swords to anyone with coin. Roads once ruled by royal law became hunting grounds for men without masters. England had won a crown across the sea and lost its soul at home. The nobles blamed one another. The crown blamed Parliament. Parliament blamed God. The throne sat beneath Henry VI, a boy who had inherited 2 kingdoms and kept neither. He was gentle, devout, and utterly unfit to rule. He spoke more to priests than to generals, more to heaven than to his own people. His father had been the hammer of France. He was the whisper of prayer. At first, the people pitied him. Then they began to fear him, because the king's mind was not always his own. At times, he would fall into silence for weeks, staring at nothing. His courtiers tiptoed around him, praying the stillness would pass. When he finally spoke again, his words were those of a child. The court called it melancholy. The people called it madness. And when a kingdom loses its mind, the knives come out. In the void of Henry's weakness, two families rose, both descended from the same royal blood, both convinced that the crown was theirs by right. The House of Lancaster, marked by the red rose, claimed rule through Henry himself. The House of York, bearing the white rose, saw in his frailty their chance to reclaim what history had denied them. At first, the conflict was whispered in corridors. Then it was argued in Parliament. Then it was shouted in the streets. Soon, the old soldiers of France found new banners to serve. The war that had devoured France was about to eat England whole. But even before the roses bloomed red and white, the kingdom was already bleeding. The peasants, crushed by taxes and broken harvests, rose in revolt. In Kent, they marched under the banner of Jack Cade, crying that justice had fled the land. They reached London's gates and demanded reform. For 3 days, the capital was theirs. Then the rebellion was drowned in its own blood. Cade was hunted down and killed, his body paraded through the streets as warning. But warnings mean nothing to the hungry. The church, once the steady hand of faith, was now another faction. Bishops feasted while their flocks starved. Priests sold indulgences for coin. The sermons that once promised salvation now sounded like taxation. Some whispered that perhaps God had left England as punishment for what it had done in France. Others said he had never been there at all. In the countryside, the abbeys stood half empty, their stones crumbling, their bells silent. The wind moved through them like a ghost. The nobles, desperate to protect their dwindling fortunes, turned their estates into fortresses. Peasant levies became private armies. Every hill sprouted a tower. Every tower flew a banner. England was no longer a kingdom, it was a chessboard. And every player believed himself king. From his palace in Westminster, Henry VI prayed for peace. But prayers cannot stop momentum. The people did not want peace, they wanted purpose. They had lived too long by the sword to remember any other tool. Even the children played at war in the alleys, red against white, shouting the names of lords they had never seen. The poet John Lydgate wrote, "This realm, once rich in chivalry, is now a mirror cracked in twain, where every man beholds his ruin and calls it right." The mirror had cracked, and through the fracture poured rage. By the winter of 1455, London was tense as a wound. Yorkist banners gathered in the north, Lancastrian in the south. The first clash came at Street Albans, a small market town turned graveyard. The roses met for the first time, and the streets ran red and white together. There was no glory, no chivalry, only confusion, smoke, and blood. When it ended, the king himself was found among the fallen, wounded but alive. The realm he ruled, however, was already dead. From that day, England belonged to no one. The battles that followed were smaller than those fought in France, but crueler. They were wars of cousins, of betrayals, of nights when the line between friend and foe blurred in the dark. No foreign invader could have done what the English now did to themselves. Manors burned, harvests failed, families vanished. The red rose and the white took turns blooming over fields of ash. The chroniclers stopped counting years by the reign of kings and began counting them by the battles Wakefield, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury. The century that had begun with knights charging under the sun ended with brothers drowning in the rain. And through it all, the people remembered France, the land they had lost, the wars they had won, the saints they had burned. It had all come back home to them, in kind. The 100 Years' War had been their mirror, and now it showed them their own reflection. Somewhere in Kent, a farmer turned his field and unearthed an old English coin from the time of Edward III. He rubbed the dirt away and saw the faint image of a king's face. The silver was worn thin, the inscription nearly gone. He tossed it aside and went back to his plow. The soil closed over it again, as if history itself were tired of remembering. The kingdom that had once dreamed of ruling 2 crowns now struggled to keep one. The sea that had once carried armies to France now separated England from itself. Castles fell into disrepair, the roads overgrown, the people older than their years. And in the churchyards of forgotten villages, graves multiplied too many to name, too many to mourn. Some were marked with red roses, others with white. Most had none at all. Just earth, just silence, just the wind moving through the grass. On one such mound, at the edge of an abandoned manor, 2 roses grew wild, one red, one white. Their stems tangled, their petals bruised by rain. In summer, they bloomed together. In winter, they froze together. No one planted them. No one tended them. They simply were the last flowers of a kingdom that had forgotten how to bloom. War had returned to England, this time without glory, without saints, without songs. It was not the war of kings and banners anymore. It was the war of exhaustion. After Street Albans, the kingdom fractured like a mirror dropped on stone. Families split down the middle. Brothers fought on opposite sides of the same hedge. Castles once built to guard against France now turned their cannons toward neighboring hills. The banners of red and white roses fluttered over the same gray mud. No foreign invader ever came. England was its own enemy now. The war moved like weather, unpredictable, cruel, and without reason. In one year the red rose triumphed. In the next, the white. Kings fell and rose again like tides. The bloodline of Plantagenet, once mighty enough to rule 2 crowns, devoured itself from within. Henry VI drifted through the chaos like a ghost of the crown he once wore. He prayed while others plotted, fasted while others fought. When York's forces seized London, the king was found in a chapel, kneeling, eyes vacant. They said he did not even notice when they placed a paper crown upon his head in mockery. He was no longer a ruler, only a relic. But every void calls forth a conqueror. From the house of York rose Edward, the son of the slain duke, tall and golden like the kings of legend. He was everything Henry was, not young, fierce, decisive. His soldiers adored him, his nobles feared him, and the people, weary of weakness, began to follow him. They called him the sun in splendor. In the spring of 1461, the 2 sons of England, Henry and Edward, marched toward each other through snow and wind. Their armies met near a village called Towton in Yorkshire. It was Palm Sunday, though there were no palms, only frost and steel. The chronicles say 60,000 men stood on that field, the largest army England had ever seen, facing itself. No priests blessed them, no hymns were sung. Only the howl of the northern wind and the muffled creak of armor broke the silence before dawn. The snow began to fall. The Yorkists took the higher ground. Their archers, veterans of France, knew the wind's secret. They loosed their arrows with the gale at their backs. The shafts vanished into the storm and fell like ghosts upon the Lancastrian ranks. The enemy's return fire fell short, lost in the blizzard. The snow turned red long before the armies met. When they finally clashed, it was not chivalry, it was slaughter. Swords broke, maces crushed. Men slipped on the frozen blood of their comrades. The banners disappeared in the storm. Colors no longer mattered. Only survival did. The river Cockbeck, running beside the field, began to swell with bodies. Some tried to flee across it. Others were dragged down and drowned beneath the weight of armor. The battle raged for hours, and the snow kept falling silent, endless, merciless. Toward evening, Edward himself charged into the fray, his armor streaked with mud and gore. The weight of his men pushed the Lancastrians back inch by inch. As night fell, the red rose broke. Thousands were cut down as they fled, hunted across the moors. Chroniclers later wrote that the blood ran so thick in the meltwater that it turned the stream crimson for days. Locals said it never quite ran clear again. The victory was absolute. The cost was unimaginable. When the storm cleared, the field was a graveyard. Helmets lay open like broken skulls. Horses froze where they fell. Snow and blood became one. No song marked the end of the battle, only the wind, whispering through 1,000 dead. It was said that after Towton, birds did not sing there for a generation. Edward rode among the bodies in silence. He had won his crown, but in that frozen field, he also inherited a curse. For every man he ruled, another lay beneath the snow. The war had given him a throne, but taken his country. Henry VI was captured months later, half-starved, half-mad, hiding in the north. He was led through London in chains, his eyes vacant, lips murmuring prayers no one could hear. The people watched in silence. They did not cheer. The spectacle of kings had grown old. But even victory in civil war breeds new wars. Edward's reign was restless. His own allies turned against him. His own brothers plotted his fall. England could not remember how to be whole. The red and white roses bloomed again, season after season, until no one could tell which one was meant to stand for truth. When Henry died in the Tower of London, some said he was murdered, others said he simply stopped breathing. Either way, his passing changed little. Peace had become a language the kingdom no longer spoke. The poets of the time wrote of a land haunted by its past, of a people so used to the taste of blood that wine no longer satisfied them. Fields went untilled, harvests rotted, and children learned the names of battles before they learned the names of saints. The 100 Years' War had taken their fathers. The War of the Roses took their souls. Yet through all the ruin, the island endured. Because that is what islands do, they endure. Storm after storm they stand. And so England stood battered, smaller, lonelier than before, but still standing. From its wounds, something new would rise. A hunger for order, for control, for permanence. Out of chaos would come the Tudors, and with them, a new kind of monarchy, one born not of chivalry, but of survival. But that belonged to another century. For now, only the snow remained. Centuries later, farmers near Towton still turned up bones when they plowed the fields, jawbones with teeth, rusted swords, fragments of plate armor fused into the soil. The river still carried traces of iron that stained the reeds a faint, unnatural red. On winter mornings, mist would gather over the valley, and locals swore it looked like smoke rising again. They called it the Reign of Towton, the day the sky wept for England. No monument marked the spot, just a wooden cross on a hill, its carvings weathered away. Beneath it, the ground lay heavy with the weight of those who had once called themselves both conqueror and victim. And when the wind blew from the north, some said you could still hear the clash of steel, faint as breath, carried across the snow. Towton was not the largest battle in Europe. It was not the longest. But it was the moment England turned its fury upon itself, and in doing so, ended the Middle Ages. The chivalric world that had marched to Crécy and Agincourt had died there, buried under frost and silence. As the last light of day sank beyond the moors, the snow took on a strange hue, not white, but pale pink, as if the sky itself remembered. And there, upon that blood-soaked field, the two roses lay together, red and white, frozen in the mud, indistinguishable at last. When the fires finally died, Europe did not look the same. Its kings were older, its people harder, its faith quieter. The 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses had ended not just battles, but an entire way of being. The age of knights and banners, of saints and crusades, had burned itself to cinders. What rose from that ruin was not a rebirth, but a reckoning. In France, the fields that had once been scarred by English hoofprints began to breathe again. Villages rebuilt, stone by stone, on top of old foundations. The smell of smoke gave way to the scent of bread. Farmers returned to lands they no longer feared to call their own. The war had begun as a quarrel of kings. It ended as the awakening of a nation. Charles VII, once the hesitant heir mocked as the King of Bourges, became the restorer of France. Under his rule, the kingdom found discipline where chaos had reigned. He reformed the army, not bands of mercenaries, but a standing force sworn to the crown. He established the taille, a permanent tax that gave the monarchy power independent of nobles. It was a quiet revolution, forged not in blood, but in paperwork. The dream that had burned with Jeanne d'Arc did not die with her. It became structure. It became law. The faith that once charged across battlefields now wrote decrees and built roads. In her absence, France learned that miracles could be made by human hands. The country that had been torn apart for a century began to call itself by one name again, La France. Across the Channel, the story was different. England, bruised by civil war and haunted by memory, sought stability the only way it knew how, by force. From the ashes of red and white, a new symbol emerged. The Tudor rose, a single bloom uniting both colors. Its first bearer, Henry VII, claimed the throne not through ancient blood, but through victory and calculation. His crown was not divine, it was practical. Under him, England stopped dreaming of empires abroad and began building one at home. The wars had taught it patience, discipline, suspicion. The merchants replaced the knights. The court replaced the camp. and the sword gave way to the seal. The kingdom that had once fought for glory now fought for balance. It was no longer a land of feudal lords, but of subjects and sovereign, no longer a collection of oaths, but a single state. The monarchy, once fragile as glass, hardened into an institution of iron. The cost was innocence, but the reward was survival. Europe itself was changing. The old order, the medieval tapestry of popes and princes, had unraveled. The church, once the only voice that mattered, now whispered amid growing noise. The Renaissance began to stir in the Italian cities, bringing with it a dangerous new idea, that man, not God, might shape the world. Art flourished where blood had dried. Painters turned from saints to faces. Writers began to question, to argue, to doubt. The same hands that once built cathedrals now held quills. The war had burned away faith in perfection, but in its ashes grew something new: curiosity. In the towns rebuilt from ruin, people began to think not of heaven, but of tomorrow. The same soldiers who had marched under banners now became masons, printers, craftsmen. The same women who had watched their husbands die became keepers of land, mothers of merchants, patrons of cathedrals. The plague had taken half of Europe, but those who remained lived with a strange intensity, as if aware that life itself had become a rebellion against extinction. For the first time in centuries, birth began to outweigh death. In Paris, the bells of Notre Dame rang again, not for kings or saints, but for weddings, for harvests, for children. In London, the streets echoed with the hammering of shipbuilders, preparing vessels that would one day cross oceans instead of battlefields. In Florence, the brush of a painter named Leonardo traced the same human faces that the war had nearly erased. And yet, beneath the progress, shadows lingered. The war had left a mark deeper than scars. It had changed how Europe thought about power and death and itself. Kings no longer ruled by divine right, they ruled by survival. Armies no longer marched for honor, they marched for taxes. Faith no longer spoke with certainty, it whispered through doubt. Even the landscape remembered. The hills of Normandy, the plains of Picardy, the valleys of Gascony, each carried bones beneath their roots. In spring, the poppies bloomed red where soldiers had once fallen. The people said it was the earth remembering, and across those same fields, travelers began to move again. Merchants with carts of cloth, monks with manuscripts, children born after the war, seeing ruins not as graves, but as stories. They no longer asked who had won. The truth was simpler. No one had. Because what had been born from all that ruin was not victory, but identity. France was now French, England, English. Two nations defined not by conquest, but by endurance. Their rivalry would never fade, it would only evolve. From swords to ships, from arrows to colonies, from kings to parliaments. The war that began with a claim to a crown had become the seed of modern Europe. History never ends, it only changes its weapons. The same wind that once carried the arrows of Crecy would, in time, carry sails to the New World. The same ambition that set kings against each other would build empires across oceans. And the same fear that had haunted the peasants of the 14th century would whisper again through the alleys of later centuries, that every peace is only the shadow of the next storm. But for one fragile moment, in the late 15th century, Europe breathed. In the twilight after war, people looked up again. The stars were the same ones their ancestors had prayed to before the battles began. Only now, they seemed closer. And somewhere beneath them, in a field where wildflowers grew over old graves, a farmer's child picked a single bloom, red and white, and did not know that once it had stood for war. History has a strange way of remembering. It forgets the cries, but it keeps the echoes. It buries the bodies, but leaves the names to drift like smoke. The 100 Years' War was never just a war between England and France. It was the long, uneven heartbeat of a continent learning what it meant to endure itself. Behind the banners and the blood, it was Europe discovering the price of becoming real. For centuries, kings had claimed that God chose them. The war taught them that survival was a choice of men. The peasants who once hid from armies became citizens. The nobles who once lived by sword and oath found themselves replaced by ministers and accountants. The monks who once prayed for peace began to write the first histories of their time. as if afraid the silence might erase them too. Something subtle had changed. Faith was no longer a shield, it was a question. Power was no longer divine, it was political. And war, that old teacher, had finally taught its cruelest lesson, that no one rules the ashes. In the years after the last battles, the scars of the war remained visible everywhere. In Normandy, a traveler could still walk along a ridge and see the faint lines of trenches where archers once stood. In Aquitaine, farmers unearthed arrowheads with every new plow. In England, the children of soldiers grew up not knowing which side their fathers had died for. Some graves bore both roses, carved by widows who refused to choose. The poets of the early Renaissance spoke of the war as if it were a storm that had passed, but their words trembled with unease. They wrote of destiny and fate, but also of guilt. They sensed, perhaps, that progress always demands a price. Jeanne d'Arc had called herself the daughter of God. Edward III had called himself the heir of France. Henry V had called himself chosen by victory. But in the end, all their crowns fell to dust, and the only title left was human. That was the legacy. No one intended the birth of humanity out of hierarchy. From the bones of feudalism rose something new, the state. From the ruins of faith, the spark of reason. From a century of destruction, the faint outline of modern identity. The war that had devoured generations left behind boundaries that would define Europe for the next 500 years. It was a paradox. The very violence that had shattered unity had created nations. The French learned that to survive, they had to be French, not just Gascon or Breton, but part of a greater whole. The English learned that losing a continent forced them to discover their island. Out of defeat came definition. Out of fire, form. And yet, every century after, Europe would find new ways to repeat the old patterns, new crowns, new wars, new faiths to burn for. The 100 Years' War became a mirror every empire eventually stared into. It showed not who they were, but who they could become, if pride once again outweighed memory. The echoes of Crécy, Agincourt, and Castillon would whisper through the ages in the trenches of Verdun, in the smoke of London, in the rubble of Stalingrad. Each time the world set itself on fire, it was the same lesson retaught in a different language, that victory is never the same as peace. In the quiet centuries that followed, Europe forgot the faces but kept the ghosts. Cathedrals rebuilt on graves, streets paved over bones, statues of kings rose where peasants had once fled. Tourists came, centuries later, to marvel at the beauty of castles never meant to survive. They took photographs, unaware that every stone had been washed in history's tears. But memory does not rest in monuments. It lives in stories. In a child learning that her name came from a saint who burned. In a soldier reciting lines of Shakespeare's Henry V before marching to his own war. In an old man lighting a candle for an ancestor he cannot trace. The past lingers not because it refuses to die, but because we refuse to let it vanish. Sometimes, on a quiet morning in northern France, the fog rises from the rivers, just as it did in 1346. It rolls across the fields where archers once stood and settles in the hollows where horses fell. Locals say it looks like ghosts marching again, an army of mist, carrying banners made of breath. But when the sun climbs higher, the fog dissolves, and the land shines green once more. It is the same earth that has fed every war and every harvest since. The same soil that has held both swords and seeds. The same ground that remembers everything and forgives nothing. That is the quiet miracle of history. It goes on. No matter how many crowns fall, no matter how many flags fade, life insists on returning. Children are born, bells ring, bread rises in the ovens of towns rebuilt a dozen times. And in that endless, ordinary persistence lies the truest victory. Because survival, too, is an act of defiance. In the end, the 100 Years' War was not about who ruled France or England. It was about what it meant to be human, to fall, to rebuild, to remember. The soldiers who died never knew they were shaping nations. The peasants who endured never knew they were inventing resilience. The kings who dreamed of immortality never knew they were only writing prologues. History never keeps its promises, but it keeps its patterns. And somewhere, in the heart of every conflict that came after, The old war still sleeps, its embers glowing faintly beneath the surface, waiting to remind us that every border was once a battlefield, and every peace a pause between storms. At dusk, the fields of Normandy turn gold. The rivers of Gascony run quiet. In England, the meadows bloom with poppies each summer, their red petals catching the wind like tiny banners. They rise, fall, and rise again, fragile, stubborn, beautiful, just like the people who made them possible. The 100 Years' War did not end Europe. It made it. And as long as someone stands before a sunset and wonders what came before it, the fire will never truly go out.